welcome all of you today who are here and joining us online to Padilla POV. It's part of our series where we take a look at issues that are impacting our industry. If you'd like to join the conversation today, please use hashtag Padilla POV. Today, we've brought together an impressive group of data and insights professionals. They'll be sharing their stories, and hopefully from this, you all will have a chance to think about how you might apply data-inspired solutions to tackle your business challenges. You will meet these folks in a second. I'd like to thank the Lynn Hall here in Minneapolis and those of you who are joining us on YouTube Live. I'm going to take a moment now to introduce you to our host. He is leads our research division at Padilla, and his name is Dan Riley. He's a senior vice president at SMS Research Advisors and has more than 20 years of market research experience. He's worked in areas like finance, healthcare, retail, manufacturing, probably more. So I will bring him up to the stage. Just a note before we get started, if you're in the room here, if you could silence your phones, that will help people watching online and those of us here as well. So,
cool.
Dan.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate everyone taking the time this morning to meet with us to talk about a topic that, as communicators, we don't necessarily think about the first time, but everything we do is based in data. Over the past several years, there's been a strong push for our organizations to not only use data, but understand data. And part of what we want to do today is really explore what data means, but also look at it within the constraints that currently exist. A lot of what we're going to talk about today is data scarcity. We're going to talk a lot today about how data can impact some very specific insights if we, as it says, drill deep or go deep in the data. But before we begin, I want to take a moment to introduce our panel today. First is Mike Calero. He is currently a VP of Customer Experience at Allina Health Systems. Mike has been in the industry for about as long as I have. We were talking yesterday about you can count the number of gray hairs based on the years of experience. So Mike has much less than I do, but still we're there. Mike and I both started at the same firm, Merritt's, but in different cities. I was in Minneapolis, he was in St. Louis. And he has a wealth of experience on both the vendor side, but also the supplier side. And you'll hear that throughout the experience today. We'll be talking about both sides of that. Mike's also worked at Best Buy and most recently at Walgreens. So we welcome here today. We also have with us Kari Campbell. Kari is been in market research and insights for about 15 years or so, 20 years. He started also at a vendor side at Schlesinger, was there with them for a couple of years and then spent about a year at WPP. Until in 2010 he made the jump to General Mills, where he's had increasing levels of responsibility. Until now he has recently made the global head of insights for the yogurt group. Kari's experience is really going to talk about from the retail side and understanding how manufacturers can utilize that type of data and drill deep to help garner new insights. So welcome and thank you for being here. And then finally with us is Becca Young. Becca is currently our SVP of strategy for National, which is a sister brand of Padilla under the Avenir Global brand. Been with us for about 2 years at National, but prior to that, spent about 13 years at Edelman, doing many of the same types of things. So she's really involved in a lot of the strategy. One of the things that we talk about a lot with our clients is here's what the data means, here's what the data means to you. So in one sense, Becca is really that bridge for national clients in terms of saying, we understand here's what the data is, but here's how to apply it to you. So thank you all for being here this morning. I sincerely appreciate it. When we talk about data, we really look at it from the perspective of how do we use it? And today I want to talk about it in 3 different stages. We want to talk about, the first one is big data. And there's some specific issues related to big data that we want to explore because it's the opposite of drilling deep or data scarcity. So that's something to consider. Then the next thing we're going to talk about is customer experience. So as we go from these massive data sets of big data to much more refined data sets in customer experience, there are some elements related to drilling deep that we don't necessarily consider as a part of data, but has a direct impact on it. And then finally, we're going to talk about predictive analytics. Predictive analytics is something that's come on very strong in the past few years, and it has a lot of opportunity for us to explore and understand what people will do, but there's also some barriers to that related to how we utilize data and some very specific issues associated with that. So really where we want to start is, how did we get here and where are we going? And it's really all about the evolution of data analytics. And I said the first one we're going to talk about is big data. So you'll see on the screen this book called The Whiz Kids. Now, the Whiz Kids were a group of folks at Ford Motor Company who really helped revolutionize how we utilize data. So prior to World War II, when companies made decisions, they made decisions based on what they thought was the right thing. They had some productivity numbers with their staff, but overall, when we were looking out to the market and the customer, they just kind of made stuff up. If you build it, they will come, was a constant refrain. After World War II, these folks that had been involved in the Army Air Corps and their utilization of data to understand things like nuclear fallout, bomb yields, those ideas were put to use at places like Ford Motor Company, which is the Whiz Kids, and their development of understanding how data could impact the business decision. And what they really were looking at Ford and other companies like this is who is buying the product. That's really important to understand because big data tells us who is buying the product. Now, what's interesting with that is our first question. When we look at big data, we usually look at a lot of different sources, and one of those sources is survey data or primary data. But we know that through a variety of issues, primary data is becoming more and more scarce for us in some cases. So we're often forced to look at non-traditional sources. So I want to throw this question first to Carrie. So what are some of the non-traditional sources that you guys are using to fill in the gaps?
Yeah, so there are a few sources we use. One is we have the advantage of we have a few owned media platforms. So BettyCrocker.com is one of the platforms that we own. So we do leverage that a lot. Other ones that are more outside suppliers is a company called Numerator. And what Numerator does is they provide receipts of consumers who have gone shopping.
Sure.
And so we're able to see everything in the basket. And so if you look at those two sources, one of the ways we use it as a food company is we're very much interested in what solutions people are bringing into their lives from an eating standpoint.
Right.
So I can look at what we have on our BettyCrocker.com, which a lot of people visit to look up recipes and understand kind of new food trends. And then we can start to cross-reference that with some of the things we get from Numerator and say, hey, we're seeing an uptick in consumers buying these type of ingredients or these type of seasonings or these foods. And you can start to connect the dots and see how those things are coming together.
Right.
And that can be more credible than something of a survey, because when you go out and ask a consumer, hey, what are the things you've bought in the past 2 weeks? A lot of times we just forget as people. We have a lot going on in our lives, and so it's hard to recall exactly what you got.
Right.
But I can look at the receipt that captured everything that you actually did.
Right.
I can look at what you actually searched on our own media platforms, and then I can have a lot more accuracy and comfort in understanding what's going on there.
And one of the things that I think that you guys have the opportunity to do, if you're not doing already, is look at that and realize there are things that have nothing to do with food that are on that receipt. So are you guys using sundries and things like that, not necessarily related to ingredients, to help leverage that information to get a full, more robust picture of the buyer?
Yeah, absolutely. And that extends outside of just looking at that data example in particular. I think one of the things that you have to do when you're with consumer insights is you have to understand the kind of spheres of influence. You need to be able to go outside of it, right? And so example I like to use is a few years ago I was working in our cereal business, and we were working on breakfast items for children or families who had young children in the house, and just understanding what are the problems you're experiencing. And so we all probably know from our own lives and experience, morning time is usually pretty hectic. You're running, you're trying to get things together, you're making sure you're not forgetting things. And we were trying to understand, okay, what's the biggest competitive thing from our food products for kids, teens and tweens in the morning? And the first thing you go to is, okay, another food company. Oh, there's another type of food item, and that's easy to get to. But what really broke it open for us is spending time in homes observing and realizing that our biggest competitor from a kid standpoint, it wasn't another food item, it was actually screen time. They would rather spend 5 minutes catching up with their friends, playing a video game, going to YouTube, versus taking 5 minutes to sit down and eat a bowl of cereal, right? And if we only looked at the first apparent thing on a receipt and only looked for our particular food items or competitors, you would never get to that kind of level of insights.
Right.
So now I have to come with something that's just as compelling, or if not more, than the kids spending time on YouTube, that they're actually going to take 5 minutes to actually eat this food product.
Right. Becca, what are some of the sources that you guys are using?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I go back to your original premise, and I really agree with a lot of what Kyrie's saying here. You know, I think it's great that we're not as reliant on surveys as we used to be. You know, surveys are great. They're a really important touch point, but it's interesting. You know, our team read the book Everybody Lies by Steph Stevens-Davidovitz. If anyone hasn't read that, it's a strong recommendation. And it talks a lot about, you know, some of the fallacies and challenges of surveys, right? Especially for more personal and private areas, things that are stigmatized, right? You know, Canada legalized cannabis over the last couple of years, and I am here speaking from as a Canadian in the room here. I've marketed on both sides of the border, but you may hear a couple of Canadianisms as I talk. And we found that there, you know, consumer behavior versus respondents to a survey, there's a massive gap there because people are still a little bit uncomfortable disclosing things that are stigmatized. They don't know themselves as well. So we look a lot at ethnographic data. You know, search and social is a huge area for us. You know, we're living in a world right now where people are communicating at the speed of thought, right? The data's out there, you can find it, you can observe that, and surveys have a huge place, but, you know, we look at those as big avenues. I'd also say that, you know, one of the things we like to think about is less non-traditional data sources, but more non-traditional data matching. I'll give an example. One of the clients that I worked with not too long ago was a massive global cough drop brand. And if you're in the business of cough drops, you kind of have, you know, there's a place and time you need to be. That's not a huge foresight, you know, kind of, you're not stocking up on cough drops en masse. You're kind of buying a pack when you get sick. And then there's also a few different ways to buy that product, right? Some people want what we used to describe as like to be hugged with honey, right? It's soft and it's tasty and it's comforting. And other people are like, I'm sick and I want something that feels awful and just, you know, punches the flu till it's gone. So one of the ways we acted on that sort of complexity, right? Because that's not geographic, that's not demographic, that's a pretty complicated, you know, moment to participate in. We partnered the brand itself with Google and the Weather Network. And what we were able to do is say, okay, there's a bit of a trend here. There are, you know, some lagging indicators around when the weather is a certain way, people start getting sick. And we know enough about our product to know what that window might look like. And then there's certain type of searches that people will do when they're, you know, a honey hug kind of a sick versus a, you know, more serious, give me the ice blast to my throat kind of sick. So, you know, none of those data sources were, you know, unexpected or too non-traditional, but matching those three things together allowed us to really be smart about where and when we were serving those ads. And what's cool is companies like Weather Network, Google, they have a ton of data, no surprise, and they're really willing to partner and start to look at those kind of creative and non-traditional matching. So those are the kind of ideas and approaches that we look to and we get really excited about because, you know, the data's there somewhere and you can really get a competitive advantage by mixing it in a non-traditional way.
You know, I think one of the things that we as analysts and communicators want to understand is here's the data that we can use to really help build the argument. But there are plenty of data sets that look fantastic but have these paywalls. Right. So I don't want to pay $10,000 for data set I don't know is going to be applicable. So in your guys' experience, and Mike, I'll throw this to you, what are some of the things that tip you off that this is a data set that I need or this is a data set that really isn't going to hit the mark for me?
Well, I'm a greedy consumer of data, so
Sure.
I'll be honest with you. What I want typically is all of it.
Sure.
And a lot of times the reason is because there's a lot of interesting areas where the data will conflict.
Right.
So you have two different agencies approaching it from a different perspective, or consumers in two situations that seem similar, but that then the data proves out that they're actually very different. So if I want a full perspective on who you are as a consumer or who you are as a human, I kind of want all of it.
Okay.
That said, we do have limited resources.
Right.
And you said often you're going to want to try to peek under the covers to understand the real value of this data. For me, it always boils down to what's the outcome. What is the decision that we're ultimately trying to drive here? Because you can get lost in data foxholes all day long,
right.
And sometimes that curiosity that fuels that can be extremely productive, but often it cannot be. So for me, it's really attaching this new data set. Is this going to drive the outcome that we're trying to go after?
Okay. Are there times when you have thought you had a data set that was going to drive an outcome in one way, but took you in a completely different direction? But if you looked at that data in and of itself, it tells you the opposite of what you think is going to happen.
There's a whole category of data in my mind that does just that, and that is satisfaction data.
Okay.
There's so many flaws in how we measure, businesses measure whether people are satisfied with the experiences that we've delivered or the products that we're giving to folks.
Sure.
And it's an interesting dichotomy that's happening right now, because we've talked a little bit early here about how limiting survey information can ultimately be. Consumers are getting less and less tolerant with kind of the old school way of giving their opinions. There was a time, maybe I'm dating myself, it's maybe a little bit before my time, but there was a time where consumers actually felt privileged that you were asking them. Yeah. You want to know my opinion? Okay, hold on a second, and I'll give you all the time that you want for me to give you that opinion. Today, we're giving our opinion every single moment of every single day. It's how we vote with our wallets and what we spend. Yep. It's how we spend our time, and we know that how we spend our time is being tracked.
Yep.
It's where we go. We're sharing about our pieces about ourselves in every step that we do. So we have less and less talent for someone then to ask me, okay, well, what's your opinion about this, or what did you just do today? As a consumer, I feel like I kind of already told you that.
Right.
So being really, really careful about how the survey data goes after more maybe the motivations and the needs and kind of the underlying thinking that went with that behavior, and then let the behavioral data do the heavy lifting on what was
right.
my actual behavior.
Right.
But back to satisfaction data, people are actually complaining less and less through surveys. They found other avenues to complain.
Sure.
So what's happening globally, I think the trend is that traditional satisfaction data itself continues to kind of go up and up. And if you're looking at it, to your point, very myopically, you might fool yourself that you're doing better.
Right.
But actually what's happening is this source is getting better and better at understanding the opinions of those that are satisfied, and
right.
worse and worse at understanding the opinions of those that are not.
So one of the things that we focused on at SMS is this idea that we're looking at data as a whole perspective and trying to connect the dots with them. And we have a client right now that we're working with their data on drunken driving. And it's a state agency, and we're looking at their data, and they said, we will have all of this data we can provide you. One of them was conviction data. And we said we didn't want it. And they said, why? And we said there is literature out there that states that convictions for drunk driving tend to skew more towards minorities and tend to skew more towards women. We can't introduce that bias into our data set, because this isn't the purpose of what we're trying to understand, isn't convictions. We're trying to understand episodes of drunken driving and the behaviors that sort that. So that's a situation where for us, there was a data set that initially sounded, yeah, that sounds pretty good. We could carry it all the way through, understand the behavior, but when we started looking at it, we realized there could be a bias. So in your guys' situations, and Beck, I'll throw this to you, what are some biases that you could see in a data set that normally would look like, hey, this looks like a really good thing?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll build on the one you mentioned. I think, the biases that exist in society exist in every data set we build. The machine learning is a product of human teaching, and so, those biases exist. It's tricky, right? I think our job, and I see it similarly, to kind of that movement in journalism, right? There's no such thing as objective journalism. There's no such thing as objective data. Our jobs as interpreters of that data is to stay on the bleeding edge of where that bias might be, disclose the bias, and correct for it. And then in some cases, like the one you mentioned, correcting for that may mean eliminating that data set entirely, because there's no way to your point, I would argue there's really no way to purify a conviction or
right.
a judicial data set,
right.
or other complex issues. So on that, I would say, certainly those, health data, right? And as the woman on the panel, I'll say, the medical science, the field of medical science has traditionally been, largely dominated by male patients, male subjects, and male data sets. That's still important data, right? My team needs to play with that. My team needs to look at that, but where we really want to go. And one of the things we do most in health is digital ethnographies, or that's a place that we do a lot of that. That's helpful in starting to say, okay, we have a data set that's quantitative, that there may be bias, that bias may be gender, ethnicity, age. There are a million ways, history. It's amazing when you dig into, common studied facts that it's, wait, that study was of 14 people in this country 26 years ago. Like, are we all operating against that core principle, right?
Right.
So we need to interrogate that and, and put that data in context always, because I think that's where, we can contextualize that by following up with an ethnographic look, by really getting close to the full spectrum of people within that population, their lived experiences, and started to say, okay, where are their gaps? What, where do we see a difference? And it's our job, I think everyone on this panel, our job is to help, our companies or our clients be competitive, right? And understanding where that margin is. The research says this, the lived experience is here, that gap is a competitive advantage. Understanding that means we can be more relevant to, to whoever we're trying to talk to that may not be accurately represented in that biased data set. So that's philosophically how we approach it, and
Sure.
it plays out in examples like the one you
So
described.
I think, just to sum up, what we're hearing is that surveys play a role. The industry has acknowledged this over-reliance on survey data is really starting to drive a different perspective. We have so much technology available to us that we can actually take advantage of all of these different data sets, and they're not necessarily, in some cases, numbers. They're ethnography, as Becca said, or they might be data that Mike talked about that is looks one way to you, but when you start looking at it, it actually leads you to a completely different insight. So just this idea that the non-traditional sources don't necessarily mean data. So the next thing we want to talk about is spend a few minutes on the consumer experience. And I could talk all day about the consumer experience, but I'd rather let our friends at GE show you.
It's a General Electric blender that's going around. Completely new from base to lid. Take it apart, see what they did. The non-skid base is the lowest you'll ever see.
The decanter has a 36-ounce blending capacity.
The non-spill lid is really smart. For blending convenience it comes apart. Add additional ingredients if you will. Look, no splash, see no spill. Put them all together and you know it's true. The General Electric blender is best for you.
So for the millennial folks out there, yes, JE used to make blenders at one point, instead of just jet engines, which we all know now. The reason why we wanted to show that is that ad encapsulates a lot of the next phase of research that we're talking about, which is the customer experience. In order for GE to develop that, they had to have some understanding of what the benefits to the product were. So it focused on that big base. Well, that big base wasn't an engineer saying, well, we need to fit this motor in here. How are we going to do it? It came from GE going to folks and watching them use their product and say, boy, it really tips over a lot. So maybe we should make the base bigger so it doesn't tip. It becomes a design element associated with the product, not a function of the product mechanics. The large base for the bull, the large mouth for the 36 ounces, that also comes from consumer experience and GE watching folks use this and watching it spill everywhere. So it's this idea that when we look at consumer experience, we're looking at understanding how consumers use products, how they interact with products. And also, it brings this idea of how we are going to communicate that. So when we look at big data, there's all of these numbers, and it can be very hard for someone to understand. When we look at customer experience, what we're looking at is the process in which they conduct their activities. So there's a lot of visualization to it and a lot of maps. So when we think of consumer experience, we should think of the consumer experience map, which has the different activities people do and then some metric, some KPI that they're using in order to understand that. But it's very visual and it's very easy to understand. So the question that I have for the panel today, and Mike, will start with you, is when we start looking at data and realize that it can be impenetrable, we start looking at the ways in which we could communicate that to people who aren't necessarily statisticians. So it's really two questions. First, what the role does data visualization play? And then what are some examples in the research that you've done and the work that you've done that would show data in a different way to someone who isn't a statistician to understand it like that?
So data visualization is everything. Our job, the reason we're doing this, we're not diving into data because it's fun. We're diving into data to extract some insights so that we can then influence someone to make some decision. At the end of the day,
Right.
That's it.
Right.
So the way that you influence human beings is you tell stories. And so your data is an asset in that path towards telling the story. If the data is getting in the way of telling the story, that's a problem. Extract those data, that's no longer part of the story. If the data is helping you in telling that story or driving influence, then those are the data that you need. How you visualize that will always depend on the audience. I have audiences that love their data. And so we go in with a highly fine-tuned, detailed story for those folks. I have other folks that I'm influencing that are allergic to data. They want to know that it's fact-based. There are some folks that don't want to know it's fact-based, to be honest with you.
Sure.
And in that case, sometimes the data is hidden behind the curtain on those, right? But it's always fact-based what we're bringing. But if that's not the way that they learn and how they'll be influenced, then the data there is in service of a more contextualized story.
Okay.
So short answer is data visualization is everything.
Right.
It means extra work. It often means extra steps. It definitely means knowing your audience.
Right.
It certainly means knowing your data, but that's table stakes.
Right. So when we think about data visualization, we're often thinking about bars and pie charts and things like that. But really, for the purposes of what the next phase in data visualization is, there's really different approaches that we can take to it. One of the things that we've often worked on is this idea of the quad map. The quad map has a very specific purpose and yields a very specific suite of insights, if you will. Can you talk for a sec about times in which you've used a quad map and give us a little landscaping on what that is? And then what are some of the insights you'd expect to see from something like that?
So I will, but what I will suggest is this video you played
Yes.
was data visualization. You could have shown a bar chart with some different models of blenders, I suppose.
Right.
And it probably wouldn't have landed the point the same way that you did with that.
Right.
So that, again, I think when we think of data visualization, sometimes we think of pie graphs and bar charts, but it doesn't have to be just that. Back to the quad map. I mean, the quad map's an easy one. I mean, if the story you're trying to tell and the insight you're trying to extract has 2 dimensions, quad map's the way to go.
Right.
If it's a one-dimensional thing, don't use a quad map.
Right.
If it's a geographic message you're trying to convey, show a map. Rather than show a bunch of lines and bars and things like that, just draw the person a map. And the second that you bring that slide up or that insight, or the moment I start conveying the insight verbally, you should understand what I'm talking about right away. Because as soon as all audiences are lazy, as human beings, we're lazy. We're not here for the reason that I want you to be here for.
Right.
So as quickly as you can get me to that insight so that I can get back to doing the thing that I wanted to do, the better off all of us are going to be.
Sure.
So if I flash that slide up or that graph or that whatever visualization I'm using, the second I flash it up, you should understand what it's trying to say so you can stop doing all of the mental gymnastics of trying to understand the insight and start absorbing the insight and bringing you to that decision that you're trying to make.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So, Becca, one of the things that we've often talked about in our industry is what is data visualization, but what are some examples when data visualization isn't really adding to the discussion or adding to the insights?
I love that you threw this question because there's nothing that drives me crazier than the dearth or the tsunami of terrible data visualization that we see in industry. There is so much internal business intelligence stuff usually looks pie charty and bar charty, and you don't work too hard. But when you start putting data, trying to tell a story with data in the public sphere, right? Trying to persuade, trying to get something that's shared, shared online, that really tells a story. We do a terrible job of that, right? I see so many things. I'm sure those in the room will recognize them. I call them fontographics. They're not even infographics. It's just your data displayed in 7 fonts and a few colors, and you're like, ta-da! You know, that data added absolutely nothing, right? So I think principle 1 is, if you can separate the visualization from the data, it's not a data visualization, it's just a fontographic, right? True data visualization is fundamentally inseparable. And it shocks me that as industry, we spend so much time and effort putting, you know, ads together, spending a lot of investment in the, you know, in the data itself, and so little in how we package and prepare it. When I look at who's doing best practice in that public sphere, I see healthcare, I see journalism, I see nonprofits. They do beautiful work, right? You're trying to create empathy for a, you know, something happening around the world. You've got a website where I can click on my hometown and it maps that crisis, and I see how far that flood would have spread had it hit my shores. That's really powerful, persuasive stuff. But who's doing that, right? It's journalism, it's nonprofit, and it's healthcare for the most part. And it saddens me that we don't do better, that we don't demand better, and I think there's, you know, a massive need to change that and an opportunity to do it, but it's challenging. I mean, those fields by nature have more of an academic core beneath them, right? It's not a design team plus sort of an analyst group saying, okay, how do we make this into a pretty picture? It is hard work. It is, you know, a sort of a field unto its own that needs a storytelling lead and a really, you know, needs the room to explore and think creatively, and it's kind of a different skill set. That might not live on your current design team, and it might not live on your current data team, but building that skill, creating those partnerships, and really pushing expectations of quality and trying to go a little bit further than, you know, a fontographic, I think is something we should all be pushing ourselves toward and really, really looking to achieve.
Right.
And Becca, there's a little bit of an empathy for the audience in that, right? So the idea that, one, that I don't want my audience to have to work.
Absolutely.
And two, sometimes when you're cranking away at an insight, you get to a point where that insight is so self-evident to you and all the people that are working on it that when you prepare to share it with someone else, you think, it's obvious. They're going to see the insight here. How couldn't they see the insight?
Because you've been on the journey with it,
You've been
right?
on that journey the whole time. You've got the background of the 87 pages that are in the appendix.
Yeah.
So it's that one extra step of empathy for the audience. And sometimes like the best practice is just a small thing of pre-read it with someone.
Yep.
Just go to someone that has had nothing to do with this particular analysis and say, is it clear what I'm trying to suggest to you?
Yep.
And you'll be surprised the number of times that it's not quite so clear.
That's exactly right.
And that's often the case on the side where we have to make decisions. One of the frameworks we use a lot is kind of, I know, we know, they know.
Mm-hmm.
I first start with, what do you know? Me as an individual, having worked in this business or this company, I was like, okay, I know what I know. Now what do we know as a company? And when you have a lot of these deliverables coming in and they're just filed on different SharePoints, I need people that are coming in new to a business or new to a question or new to a company. They can look up a presentation from 1 or 2 years ago, maybe a few months, maybe 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. And they don't need the team and the analysts to sit there and walk them through it for it to make sense. It needs to be something that I can come in, you know, no background, spend a little bit of time with it, and okay, I understand the points, I understand how they got here, and I understand what points I need to take with me to make a decision. That's incredibly important, because when we don't do that, people are making the wrong interpretation of it, and then you start heading down the path of potentially wrong decisions being made that can be very costly.
Yeah.
And so the data visualization is the thing that really brings it together at the end of the day, and that's what carries that story on. Once the team leaves it, once there's no one there to walk you through and give the presentation, it still gets the right information across to the end user.
Right, and one thing that you've talked about, Kari, a lot is this idea of the story. And when we look at data visualization, we're really looking at it from two parameters, if you will. On the one hand, data visualization can live with the designer. An example is the Insight Association, the AMA, is having a data visualization seminar, and it's being headed by an artist. So when we think of data visualization, we don't necessarily think of an artist as a person to do that, but her program is very compelling. On the other side, we have the statistician, and the statistician is data visualization. There are some wonderful examples, but the most famous and maybe notorious is Edward Tufte. If you don't know who Edward Tufte is, type Edward Tufte Waterloo, and you will get the most frightening graph of your entire life. But what he attempted to do was to visually show Napoleon's campaign through Europe. And it's really neat that he tried it, but by today's standard, we'd look at that and go, what the heck is he trying to say? So what I'm posing to you, Carrie, is that we have these two parameters. Where is the meeting space between the statistician and the artist? Where does that come in? Where is that nexus, if you will?
They have to walk that path together, and usually from the beginning is the best, right? It's what do we need to help bring to life? What's our objective here? What's our end game? And if you have that understanding from the beginning, you can still walk your own separate paths, come from your separate sides, but you know where you're going to meet and why. Because otherwise, it's not going to work. It's going to be very one-sided, and they're both bringing very valuable parts to that equation, right? And so if you're just laying the artist part of it fully get there, there can be a tendency for it just looks great. You know, it's a wonderful visual, but it's not really syncing up with the true data set beneath it, right? Or if you're coming strictly from a very much data set or scientific standpoint, yeah, if I have the background and I have the depth of knowledge to understand what you're telling me, sure, I can get there. But the majority of end users do not have that, or they do not have the interest to go that far, right? And so if you're having that discussion and agreement at the beginning, you're going to get to a much richer place at the end. It's going to be visually appealing. It's going to be very simple. It's going to be very intuitive, but it holds true in the integrity of the data set and what it's telling you.
Right.
And at the heart of that for me, I'm just going to underscore a point that you made, and to the heart of it for me, it's the skill set that's the common ground between those is storytelling.
Right.
And if there's a seminar that I'm going to go to that's going to make me better at this, it's probably a storytelling seminar. And one of the things they're going to teach you there is this old adage of kill your darlings.
Right.
The statisticians are going to walk in with all of their baggage, but you need to know this, and you need to know this, and you need to know this. And the artist is going to walk in with all of their baggage.
Right.
These are the things. Oh, this makes it gorgeous and beautiful, and all of these other things. But at the heart of that, there's an insight, and we're trying to tell a story about that insight. So if you can find a way to shed all of the unnecessary components of that, and just do this beautiful, elegant story about that insight, you're going to have a much better chance of influencing.
So the one thing, and that's a great point that I'm glad you brought up, Mike, is that when we talk about data visualization, what we're really talking about is story. And we're talking about telling that story in a compelling way that makes the most sense, not only for the statistician, not only for the artist, but also for the account teams that own the client, for the manager that owns the director. That opportunity to be able to say, I'm giving you a story that not only tells something interesting, but moves you in a way towards an action. If the story doesn't move you to an action, then it falls apart.
I also want to build on one small point that we've been making, is we've been using the term art and design interchangeably in this short discussion, and in some ways that makes sense. I'm a huge advocate of bridging the world between industry and commerce, and two spaces I'm particularly passionate about. One is academia, and I'll probably talk about that more today, and the other is the art world, right? There is amazing stuff happening in data-driven art. There was an artist from Victoria whose name I will forget, but she had an installation that was a bird that flew based on how heavy the traffic was nearby, right? So the little bird would flap its wings. That's incredible stuff, right? We can bring some of the spirit of the art community. I think we're limiting our toolkit if we consider, the creativity and that expression side to stop at the designers in our studios and on our teams. I think we can be inspired and find a ton of really interesting ways. I'm not suggesting we should have Traffic Bird and that should be your core data product, but there's a lot of really interesting innovation happening there. And the more we look at that, the richer our work can become, and the more breakthrough and attention getting. And ultimately, you want to be able to tell that story, to persuade that action, to drive that decision. You need to get someone's attention to do that.
Right.
And those tools and practices, I think, are just a really rich area that we're not mining nearly enough.
I love that example, and I love the immersiveness of that example. One of the best ways to tell a story to your audience is to make them live it. So for example, back in my old days in the retail space, we were targeting a certain type of consumer that had nothing, that was as far removed from the executives that were making decisions about targeting that consumer as could be. So we had all sorts of PowerPoints and decks and presentations and everything to try to brand, and we hired artists to draw renderings of this consumer and put them all over the walls, and all that stuff works to some degree. What worked the best is we gave them a plan to live the life of this consumer for a week. Here's how much you're going to spend on groceries.
Right.
Yeah.
Here's what you're going to do with your evenings.
Right.
Here's what you're going to do with your mornings. And after a week of living like that consumer, with all the shackles or freeness that came, they understood the consumer way better than a single PowerPoint can do.
Sure.
Totally.
I like that. That reminds me of it's immersive the same way that the art world is kind of starting can leverage data to create something immersive.
Right. And I think that the one really cool thing, just to sum up what you're talking about, is that when we're telling a story, we shouldn't be constrained by what is the data versus what is design versus what is art. What we should be constrained by is what's going to connect with that audience on an emotional level, but also connect with that audience on a, for lack of a better phrase, business or statistical level. So I really appreciate you guys talking about that so much. I now want to shift gears and look at predictive science. Now, predictive science is the culmination of all of the work that's been done to date. The initial idea was to understand the consumer. Then customer experience was to understand the product. But now that we have those done, we have this wonderful mergence between statistics and technology. So now we have the ability to understand what people are doing in the time that they're doing it. We now have research at the moment, and that allows us through AI, through machine learning, to really start to understand what people are going to do. So when we talk about predictivity, what we're talking about is what is that person going to buy? So now we have the ability to tell you, you in the next 12 months are going to buy this, or you in the next 6 weeks are going to buy this. Now, there's some good ways in which AI and machine learning have been used in predictive science, and there's some challenging ways in which it's been used. But the one thing that all of this requires is a lot of data. The more data you have, the more accurate your prediction can be. So there's entire models built around this idea. The Monte Carlo method, which again came out of World War II, only functions with a massive amount of data. The small amount of data that you put into it is going to yield you a very different result as compared to a larger data set. So we know that there's this idea that predictivity requires a data set, and it requires a lot of data. And since we're trying to predict what people do, there is a tendency to want to get personal, to get that data that actually might mean something to someone. So we always button up against privacy. So now we have this conflict in predictive data where we have these massive data sets and we have a lot of personal information. So what we're trying to understand is how privacy impacts our analysis. As we're driving deep in the data, as we're drilling deep, we're going to hit some pretty personal things. And we're going to understand some things about you that you may not be comfortable in knowing. So one of the questions that I want to ask, and Becca, I'll throw it to you, is what are some of the ways in which you see privacy impacting the analysis that we perform?
Yeah. So, I mean, hugely, right? This is a really current and timely conversation that, it's hitting the news. You see this conversation emerge often. So I think number one, privacy is massive, and especially in spaces that are a little bit more high stakes or personal or have consequences, right? Medical data, there's no question that needs to be, really carefully protected, thought about. And it's interesting, right? I think there's a couple of layers to your question, right? One of them is, what relationship are you in with the person whose data you have? When you think about predictive, it's fascinating. If I'm not in a relationship with someone, I'm kind of pissed off when they follow me through. I've visited your website once, or I've seen the picture of the boots just because I was distracted or maybe sleepy and I accidentally clicked an ad, and those boots are friggin' stalking me for the next 6 months. It's like, I don't want them. They're not my size. That was an accident. Get off of my case. What's interesting is when you're in a relationship with a company or a brand, and I think some of the best examples of predictive, data are companies like Netflix, right? Netflix does an amazing job, and it can't get predictive enough, right? I look at that and I'm like, you don't know me well enough. I can't believe you suggested my rom-com. Or Amex, right? Amex does an amazing job with AI fraud prevention, and I love it, right? I am really happy that when I went to Sri Lanka this year, it knew I was really there, and then when someone else goes to New Jersey with my card and I'm not there, they somehow know which is me and which isn't, really thoughtfully. I love getting that phone call because I'm in a relationship with them and I want them to know as much as they possibly can about me. So I think all to say, privacy really matters. I think the nature of your relationship matters. I'm a fan, and one of my mantras is give the data to the grown-ups, right? And what I mean by that is internally give them to the data people. Don't give it to your brand manager. They know what to do with it. And this is an area where, when I talked about some spaces that I really want to see infuse business more, this is where academia can really be something to look at and listen to. Your data analysts at your team or at your organization probably have an academic background because that's the skill set they need to do what they need to do with that data. They might have a master's degree, PhD, who knows. To me, you're not just hiring them to bring that skill set, you're hiring them to bring that mindset. Right? There are tremendous best practices established in the academic space around how to handle data, how to manage privacy. Those best practices are ones that when you have that resource on your team or an ability to look for that, you should be empowering them to say, bring that policy here, and then you kind of have to do what they say. And that can be frustrating for marketers, right? We have those moments of tension where you're like, but we already know about them, can I just market to them? And we really look to those practices to hold the line and those, the letting the grown-ups in the room have the data and sort of control the data helps us from playing to our worst instincts and, holds the line exactly where we need it to.
Right. So I really want to hear your thoughts on this, because of your role not only in healthcare today, but in the past several years. So how are you, from a healthcare perspective, creating that balance in understanding that there's a lot of private information out there that you could know that could yield wonderful insights versus the regulatory issues that you were facing when you're looking at data?
So first and foremost, nothing's more personal than your health. So privacy is of utmost importance.
Right.
And I'm a little bit new to the healthcare space. Previously, I spent a lot of time in retail, and privacy is very important for retail. It's just at another level with
Right.
healthcare, and mostly because consumers want it to be. I'll underscore a little bit about what Becca was saying. Is it's really around trust.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm one-on-one, face-to-face, either electronically or in person with my physician, I kind of want them to know everything about me.
Yeah.
Right? At that point, we've built this relationship of trust, and it's frustrating to me, in fact, when they don't know other things about me. If I talk to two physicians and they haven't shared in the way that I expect them to share, that's wildly frustrating to me. But because there's that umbrella of trust that's occurred. Now, if behind the scenes, I'm taking data from your life here and taking other data from your life here and taking other from your life there, and then somehow building that together, something that's in service of me, but not necessarily apparently a service to you, you're gonna get frustrated with that, and you're not gonna like that.
Right.
Because that's now outside of this umbrella of trust.
Right.
To your question about how do you lead to good decisions while still protecting the privacy of individuals, we go back to your point about lots of data. So while now maybe not necessarily I can or want necessarily to talk about you personally and your specific health conditions in driving whatever sort of product I'm building or decisions I'm trying to influence, but I'll look for lots of folks like you.
Sure.
And then I can disguise who you are, but the broader patterns that I'm seeing there, because it's the having access to that wealth of information
Right.
Allows me to make great decisions without having to get into the dark corners of anti-privacy that you don't want me to get
Right.
into.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we're often faced with is understanding how to serve up content, how to bring offers to customers that make sense in the moment. And this brings up an interesting perspective. Let's say I'm on the phone, I'm talking with my friend, I'm talking about dog food. And talking about the different types of dog food and what do I need to get. And I like this brand, but I don't like this brand.
By the way, what an amazing phone conversation.
I have great friends. So I hang up the phone with my friend, and I log on Facebook, and the first thing I see is an ad for dog food. And it's that particular brand I talked about. Now, the question becomes, is that a coincidence? Or is there some outside activity occurring? If it's just a coincidence, then the question becomes, how predictive is too predictive? Where have we gone too far in pushing the predictive button? And Carrie, I'll start with you.
How predictive is too predictive? I think it does go back to the previous question. What are we predicting?
Right.
Is it something that's very personal, whether it's towards health, maybe it's something towards finances? those things are very personal. And just putting myself in the shoes of someone else maybe experiencing that, those are things I don't want to be widely known. Those are things I want to keep either within myself or my circle of people who I trust for that. But if it comes to something that's, not material, so, oh, you know what, they know that I want this type of food.
Right.
I'll use food because I'm working in the food industry, right? Or this flavor, or man, they know that I might actually be interested in that. That becomes kind of compelling, becomes appealing. And from a consumer standpoint, I don't know if it's going, that to me isn't that predictive. It's not crossing a threshold.
Right.
But I really think it depends on what they're predicting.
So I'll give you another example. Let's say I'm on the phone with a physician and my child is having difficulty keeping food down and has had a very hard time since they were 4 or 5 keeping food down. And the doctor calls me and says, well, we did a test and your child has celiac disease. And for a parent to hear that, it can be devastating because you don't know what it is. And the first thing that your doctor says is, well, you need to meet with the dietitian, but what you really want to do is you want to find a food that works. So you hang up the phone, you go on Google, and you type celiac food. And what pops up? Potato chips. Potato chips are the #1 food that celiacs eat, because celiacs are kids, and kids like potato chips. So they buy potato chips. Now for the next week, let's say I'm served up content on potato chips. That's helpful to me because I made that decision. But what if I hang up the phone with my physician, I log on to Facebook, and there's ads for potato chips? I never mentioned potato chips to the doctor. We only talked about celiacs. Coincidence or too predictive? In that situation, what do you think? And I'll open that up to the panel.
Yeah, and I'd say for me personally, too predictive. As someone who is a researcher and a marketer, I have reservations with that and wonder how did it get there and what exactly is the end game of it. Because you do start to head into some territory where you have to have some very clear lines drawn. Right. But I do think for some people it does depend on them. There are a set of consumers, especially as there's more transparency than ever, there's more access to things than ever before. From the moment you're thinking of something, you can go and search it and find it, and all those things work together. So I do think there is a subset of consumers that actually find that appealing and interesting.
Sure.
And it takes away some of the work from them. But I think in a broader sense, there are a lot of people, and for good reasons, have concerns about it. And we need to keep this conversation of data privacy at the forefront because we need to be doing everything. It needs to be done responsibly. I cannot underscore that enough. You need to have integrity as how you're getting there.
Right.
So it's a very, but it's also a sticky subject. It's very complex. It's not an easy one to get into. So
Yeah,
from my standpoint, that's where it is.
We're
You
both
sure?
in here, yeah.
Go.
Okay, I'll go.
You're closer to him.
All right, we'll pass it counterclockwise, whatever.
I'll give you the power.
There we go.
I think a couple of things. I think your dog food example is frankly not predictive enough. That is not a valuable thing. So I think the experience you're having, the predictive world I want to live in is you hang up that phone call and it's not immediately served to you in Facebook as if there's any value to that. As you're driving home in Waze, a thing comes up that says, hey, do you want dog food? It's on sale right here at the store you like to buy it at.
Right.
That's valuable, right? I think about this stuff a lot in terms of personifying the experience. And what we right now call predictive would be an insane consumer experience. It's the guy in the store saying like, what about the boots? What about the boots? Hey, did you forget about the boots? And 2 weeks later, they're at your door like, you looked at these boots 2 weeks ago. You're like, that is an insane thing that, you would be fired for. So I think one is there's a ton of places we can go with predictive. I think it can be, again, building it around the consumer experience, finding the right stakes, right? That's okay for dog food. It is absolutely not okay for your child's health. Those are different. And then I also think when things start to get, sort of too predictive or, when you start to really bristle against that, it's when it plays, it's when it's predicting something that you don't want to admit or you don't want to share.
Right.
You know, so the Walmart baby box, I don't know if you guys remember that experience,
Yep.
but fascinating, right?
Yep.
Using predictive data to say, okay, if you start to shop and even search our site in this way, you are likely pregnant. I don't know, this was a few years ago, you likely heard this case because it made a lot of news.
Yep.
And what they started doing was in response to those behaviors, they were proactively sending a little welcome kit or a, hey, are you having a baby, what's up? They sent it to a pregnant teenage mom in a household that was, you know, not a comfortable conversation, and it had massive implications for that young woman. So, you know, that is too private, that's too high stakes, and that's not something that you should share. Similarly, you know, there's a great Canadian company that I think made global news, Ashley Madison, which is the startup for cheaters. So it is a date matching site for, you know, you want a little bit on the side, you're in a committed relationship, Ashley Madison. That was the kind of, you know, and they were serving those ads to particular, you know, it wasn't just a gender and age and marital status thing, they were doing more predictive things. And that, you know, the moment you saw that ad, you're like, what the hell, right? Same thing for women approaching 40 and either a weight loss or are you gonna get married or are you desperate to get married ad, right? Those things that are those sort of private areas and things you don't really want to embrace, right? I have a dog, I eat dog food, or I don't eat dog food, I need dog food. You know,
that would explain a lot.
Exactly. Hi guys. But you know, all to say, like that, there's a line there, and I think, you know, it's around the consumer experience, around what do you want to share and where do you want to spark those conversations? I don't want to have conversations around private health matters, financial matters, as Kyrie said, but I'm cool talking dog food, right? But I want that to be packaged in an experience that's a little bit more built for me, and I want the directions when it's on sale and not just a Facebook ad, because we're really crude with predictive, I would say. We are really not, we're nowhere near too predictive, we're too exposed when we share data, and we're not predictive enough when we just chase people down the street with the same ads.
What do you think about that?
So mostly I'd just be repeating what they said. So maybe I'll just, I think those were both great points of view. Maybe I'll just underscore a couple of things, and I think it boils down to this sense of responsibility. I tend to separate privacy from predictiveness. Like I don't see predictive as an evil thing. And I don't personally think that you can ever get too predictive. Driving here today, I sat at a red light and I sat at where no other cars were going. There was no safety issue with this red light, and it made no sense to me that me and the other person coming this way were both just sitting at the red light, thinking, why can't this be more predictive? This should know that there's no safety concern here, let us go. So from my point of view, but there was no responsibility issue that we were crossing. And I think that's what it boils down to. All of these examples around where we felt, ooh, they were being too predictive, was actually, no, they were being as predictive as everybody else is being, except they used it irresponsibly. And that, to me, that's the ethical discussion. It's not the predictiveness.
Right. So that leads us to this last point that I want to talk about is we look at paid and we look at earned media. And we're now starting to see they're coming together so that it's becoming more difficult to say the difference between what is paid and what is earned. Now, assuming that all of the actors are ethical, so there isn't any malfeasance happening, how does that matter? And I'll give you an example. I call it the Cyrano de Bergerac model. So Cyrano is a wonderful writer, and he has a dear friend, Christian. Christian loves Roxanne, but isn't good with words. So Christian asks Cyrano, hey, will you put the words in my mouth so I could say these lovely things to Roxanne? And Cyrano, who also loves Roxanne, says, sure, I'll do that. So Cyrano's in the bushes whispering these beautiful words, and Christian is belting them out to Roxanne, and Roxanne is eating them up. Well, Roxanne eventually figures out, Christian tells her, that it wasn't him with those words, it was Cyrano. And in the end, Roxanne comes with Cyrano. Here's the question I have for you. Cyrano is the brand. Christian is the media source. Roxanne is the consumer. Now, in the end, Roxanne went with the brand. The customer went with the brand because they liked what they were hearing. But it wasn't an earned media. Roxanne didn't earn those words from Christian. He was paid. He paid someone to give him those words. But she doesn't care because she loves Cyrano. So in that model, with paid and earned coming closer and closer together, does the consumer care? If they're acting in an honest and rational way, does the consumer care? Does the consumer know to care? And that's the group thing I'll put out to the group. Does the consumer care that they're hearing something that they may think is earned but is actually paid?
It depends on the consumer. It depends on the person, right? And it really depends. Some people value who it's coming from. Other people value more the message and the information they're
Right.
getting. Right. I think by and large, people are more shifting towards, as long as I'm getting accurate information, it's going to be helpful to me. The way it gets delivered to me almost becomes entertainment in a sense. So if you look at a lot of paid influencers, people follow influencers partially for their entertainment,
Right.
to understand what's going on in their life, but they also start to build trust in what they're telling them about. But they start to understand there's an entertainment value to it, right? Somewhere, if we look at movies, we look at TV shows, we look at music, it's not necessarily that you have to like the actor, but maybe you're just getting the message out of it. And that's all you're looking for, right?
Right.
And so I think as the things start to mesh together, as long as the right message with right information is being delivered, people are becoming less and less concerned with who's delivering it to them in terms of making the actual decision. And there's less of a concern of, is it deception? Is there deception going on? Because there's a brand behind it.
Right.
I'll buy that. I wonder if there's different, I'd love to see the academic study on this one, if there's different trust thresholds. So if I know that it was paid, I bet I have a different trust threshold than if it was earned. If it's earned, I'm expecting you to have gone through those extra steps to make sure this is accurate and factual and useful to me and all those things. If you violate that trust, then I'm no longer actually going to be receptive to. I got lost in your analogy, but that medium,
Right.
like whoever that medium was.
So in this case, what we're saying is that as long as the message is good, as long as Christian is saying those lovely words to Roxanne, then it doesn't matter the fact that Christian is being paid by Cyrano, or Cyrano's paying Christian to give those words. The idea that I want to make sure I understand is that you said it depends on the consumer. Kari, there's 300 million of them, or 383 million consumers now. Mm-hmm. So how do we as marketers distinguish this consumer is okay with me saying that it's earned when it's actually paid? Yeah. And this consumer isn't. And maybe, Becca, because you're in the field, you have a more succinct POV on that. But want to understand, how do we determine that?
I don't know if it'll be more succinct, but I do have a lot of opinions on that. So no question the two spaces are becoming increasingly blurred. Some might see that in a negative way, right? Native advertising, things that really look like an earned article that aren't. There's some really cool things happening behind the curtain around, we're able to do attribution and measure earned in a way that we have never been able to do before, a toolkit that was previously only available to paid. And that's folks like, Cision has a product called Impact that does a really good job, where if you read an earned media article about why, I'll go back to boots, why all-weather boots are the best things to walk to work in, and then within 90 days I searched for all-weather boots because I wasn't buying boots when I read the article, it can attribute that back to that earned coverage. Really cool, and that's starting to be, full funnel pull-through that we see in earned that we hadn't seen in paid. And it was, so I think A, the lines are becoming blurred. B, in a low-stakes scenario, that's not a bad thing and probably a good thing, right? So I spent a lot of my career trying to get earned coverage for brands that had a story to tell, and we did our very best to, create a moment and a news angle and a hook. And at the end of the day, in an increasingly shrinking journalistic environment, they don't really want to talk about snack crackers. All respect to General Mills and the CPG foods. So it's great to have an opportunity to put paid articles, to create cool brand experiences, to tell them that we're doing something fun and interesting and meaningful that they want to play with. When the stakes are higher, there's still an expectation I see. There's still, the trust in journalism wobbles and wanes, and often it connects to your presidential cycle here in America, candidly, or at least lately, this, the fake news phenomenon. But there is, we still see consumer backlash on more serious topics when there's a sense that there's not an objective, or at least a mandate to be objective, right? Even a simple example, I think you can almost quantify the dollar figure of when those stakes start to tip. For anyone that was following the mattress blog scandal of, I think, last year, this was, a great sort of just window into this world where one of the biggest kind of, Casper mattresses, ND mattress, all of, that who knew, right, that the next startup space was internet mattresses. I couldn't, if you'd asked me to put $50 on that 10 years ago, I would have lost that 50 and then some. But all to say that blew up, and then there were several sites that were objective third-party review sites that behind the scenes had been acquired or compensated by one of the mattress owners, and that $1,000 mattress price was enough to really piss people off when they realized that those weren't authentic reviews, that wasn't objective. So I think as marketers, one of the things we really, if there's a theme to a lot of the discussion we've had is, there's no one size fits all answer for this. What relationship are you building with consumers? What's the stake around your industry or product? And if it's pretty low stakes commodity, decisions are made at shelf, there's a license to have some fun with that, and consumers don't expect as much sort of objectivity in the media and sensitivity around how you engage with them. But as soon as you get out of that into something that is higher stakes, it's higher investment monetarily or higher stakes personally, whether it's health or something like that, politics, those kind of things. We see a lot of paid lobbying gets that can be criticized, and the fact that we see that backlash. I mean, our job, I think, is not to say this is what should or shouldn't be, although in certain cases like ethics, absolutely, but also just to listen to what consumers are saying. Where are their tolerances, right? Where are those lines? And I still see a line there. I see it's a bit elastic, right? They care in some spaces and less than others, but the backlash there tells me there's still a line that matters between earned and paid.
Right. Yeah. So that's a great point to consider. So we've talked about a lot of things today, and the panelists have done a wonderful job in informing and providing insights into that. So what are the takeaways for you guys? So from my perspective, I see three. The first one is, when you're looking at data, don't necessarily look at the traditional sources. Look at other sources to help build those bridges together. So if you're looking at doing survey data, look at also doing some ethnography. Look at doing some interviews as a way to add value to this. Look at the idea of doing some scraping as a way to, social media scraping, as a way to build a more robust data set. So that's the first takeaway. The second takeaway around data visualization is that there needs to be a story. And in order for there to be a story, there needs to be a storyteller. As communication experts, guess who's really good at telling stories? We are. So let us lead that effort between the statistician and the designer. Let us be that nexus, that storyteller, to help spread this across the group. And finally, when we start talking about predictive analytics, remember that when we start communicating those messages, we have to be aware not only of the channel, but more importantly, the audience. I think we as communicators spend a lot of time obsessing about channels, but these channels are starting to blur, especially around paid and earned. And consumers don't seem to care. But to Carrie's point, it depends on the consumer. And how to pick that particular consumer becomes a challenge to us. That becomes the predictive element. What I'd like to do now is turn it over to the audience for questions that Tina's going to help us facilitate.
I'm back.
We've already had some questions come in, so certainly if you're in the room or you're joining us on YouTube Live, you can submit questions. But I'm going to start with one that's already come in. So everything you've all talked about, it's not easy stuff, right? It takes a lot of time, it takes resources, it takes $10,000 data sets. So how do we all encourage, or what's your advice on how we encourage organizations that we work with to invest in it and to do it the right way?
So I'll start with that one. One way in which we can do it is to a degree of what Mike said, is take a look and say, what do we want to understand from all this? So what's our goal in this? If our goal is to understand how consumers are purchasing and eating yogurt, to Kari's point.
It's good stuff.
It's
Yogurt's the best.
yogurt is delicious.
Love it.
Any brand in particular?
Yeah, any brands in mind?
Perhaps Yoplait?
Exactly. Yoplait.
For example.
For example. Non-specific, of course. So this idea that there's an affinity for yogurt, I need to be able to say, where's the data set that I'm going to go and get that, and then justify it before I go ahead and do it. Instead of on the back end saying, well, I got this data set, it cost a lot of money, and I didn't get as many insights from it. It's more about preloading it and helping them understand this is the value that you're going to get. That's my take on it.
I also think a really quick response is an easy way to get someone to invest in research is to remind them how expensive mistakes are, right? It's, $10,000 data set sounds scary until you realize, you're looking to inform a $10 million campaign, right? And it's not always like, the budgets aren't always that big. God, I wish they always were. But, the foresight at the beginning saves a ton of problems later. And, once you start talking in that way, I also really like starting with the end state. Okay, you're trying to get to this, and it's amazing how ambitious we are in those goals, right? The big, hairy, audacious brands, it's, we want to go from we didn't exist last month to the number one in XYZ by this. Sometimes just walking through those steps makes it so clear how important insights are, right? Okay, you're number one here, that means everybody loves you. So before that, some people love you. So before that, some people discover you. How do you know to choose the right people, right? That's how you get from the we're marketing to everybody to we can only get to everybody through specific somebodies. And by the time you start to unpack all of those steps and, it feels a little scary and people realize, I loved your language earlier, what we know, what they know, what we don't know, or I'm bridging that terribly, but all to say that, illuminating the areas of ignorance and talking about how expensive those blind spots are doesn't always solve it, but can at least go a long way towards
the
making that
magnitude
case.
comparison is very helpful, right? Because what happens when you say a $10,000 data set, I start thinking in the context of just my research budget for, let's say, for the year. I have to manage to this number, but you're making a $20 million decision, right? And so when you start to compare those magnitudes, $10,000 becomes a rounding error. Because if I save my way to this, the material kind of impact, if I get that campaign wrong, we're going to be talking about this 6 months later, and we're going to be wishing who decided not to spend $10,000 to get this data set. Who made that decision, right? And so I think when you make that comparison, you start to bring the entire magnitude in. That's something that's very helpful. And then the key part about what you said is invest.
Right.
We're investing in this data set, right? You're not going to save your way to greatness. You're not going to save your way to an amazing insight.
Right.
You're going to have to invest your way towards that, and you have to have those conversations.
Sure.
All right. Questions from, yes?
Ooh, exciting.
So I'm curious, in a world where you can really target specific individuals, how relevant are personas nowadays for your specific roles in companies? Because I think I work at 3M, and we really struggle at how broad and general personas have become and how unhelpful they really are. So I'm curious, how are you shaping personas now to really know who you're targeting, right? A consumer is no longer a consumer. There's all sorts of segments within that. So what does that look like for each of
And
you?
let me just repeat that in case it's not audible online. The question was, in today's world, how relevant are personas and how do you shape them to do everything we try to do with data today?
Right.
So I can start. I think you're bringing up a good point. The end state here, I think, is as segmentations of one. We're all ultimately our own segment. That often leads to the most powerful communication and often leads to the most powerful outcomes. That said, there's a lot of decisions, just practically speaking, there's a lot of decisions that we'll be making where we can't make an individual decision for every one of our single consumers. And that's often where then those personas can come in.
Right.
Because you're going to aggregate all of these different folks and make decisions around maybe a media buy that can't be targeted that way, or a product development that can't be customized down to that level. So I found that there's still a role for personas that can be very, very powerful. But I really like your point. I mean, ultimately, the end goal here, though, is we'll end up with segmentations of one.
Well, and I think it's an interesting point, especially when we apply it to 3M, because 3M tends to look at segments from two different perspectives. You have the attitudinal, which is what are my opinions, normative beliefs, and control barriers that help me make a business decision. That's one set. And then the other set is title. So, and it's true for firms other than 3M, you start making personas based on titles.
Right.
And maybe based on areas where they work. So you might have pediatric nurses. That might be a persona. Now, the great thing about that is it's really easy to identify pediatric nurses. You can buy data sets that allow you to have that information, and it requires almost no intervention whatsoever. But then you're making the assumption that every pediatric nurse thinks exactly the same way. And what I like to do is I like to think about it in this context. Let's say we're all going to go on a campaign. And our campaign is to rid ourselves of the evil king that is in the castle. And I say, now is the time for us to storm the castle, and you're all going to make me king because that's what I've told you. And I'm a charismatic leader. And so we all go and we buy all of these different things. We buy swords and we buy shields, and we storm the castle, and we win, and we're victorious. And as I'm sitting there on the throne, Becca looks to Mike and says, is he a hero or an anti-hero? Because if he's a hero, he's going to lead our country in the best interest of all of us. If he's an anti-hero, he's going to do it all for himself. And he's not going to care about us. He's only going to care about that vengeance, that next thing to get. But if you look at where we shopped, it doesn't matter. We shopped at the same store. We bought the same things. We just bought it for a different purpose. If you don't understand the motivations why someone buys, you're either going to be an anti-hero or a hero. And it's important to understand that. That's why looking at that title doesn't necessarily become as effective. It has its role. Now the flip side to it is, okay, find me the person with those attitudes.
Right.
Go into a database and find that person. Hard to do. That's the challenge that we have with segmentation.
Well, and that's where I think, where you going? All right. We do a lot of segmentation and but to those two categories, we do almost zero demographic-based segmentation. Sure. That changes too quickly. We can buy that at the end against our segments, but what we build those segments on are belief-based systems. Right. All of the stuff you talked about from a motivation standpoint. And I think, that's where we do a lot of that, for example, the healthcare space, where we'll find really interesting, right? A belief system doesn't change, right? So I can get married, I can have a kid, I become a much, more active user of the healthcare system after having a kid than I did in my 20s. But I still have the same belief system about what the healthcare system should do with me, for me, and that's shared within, we see cross belief systems with HCPs and patient spaces, and those kind of segmentations continue to be helpful and give us really rich data. One of the reasons I like ethnographically built and anthropologically built, segmentation, and we go all the way down to working with PhD academics to build those. One of the things I really like about that is that also allows you to find, what's the right way to describe it? Invisible segments. Yeah. We did a project for metastatic breast cancer, which is, a complicated, very interesting space. It's counter the pink ribbon narrative. These are women that, are terminal, don't have a positive survivorship story. And when we started to do ethnographies, we found very quickly there was a significant segment of them that didn't want to touch the conversation. They would come into the community, toss a like at something, and then play Farmville for 12 hours. And we started to say, okay, what's happening here, right? This is these are people that have 3 months to live and they're spending, what we realized it was about was control over their time, right? My time is limited, I'm gonna spend it however the heck I want, and I'm not gonna wallow in a disease conversation. I'm gonna do whatever I want, even if that's wasting my time and playing Farmville to the bitter end. That was about 10% of that patient population, and using ethnography to find that was a surprise not only to the research team we were working with, but to the patient organization that had dealt with metastatic breast cancer community for 20 years and said we knew there was someone out there that was deliberately not engaging and we didn't know why. Right. And so that for me is that segment was hugely important. It drove a ton of the way they talked to that patient population, the way that brand activated. And so that to me is a segmentation with huge value that we couldn't get through demographics, that unlocked a real insight. So that's how I think if segmentations have a place, that's the richest and most interesting way to use them, in my opinion.
Questions? I have a few here, but anything from the audience? Okay, so how do you know the difference between the data you want or the data people around you think they want versus what you actually need when you're designing an analysis?
So I think for our perspective, what we're really trying to determine is does the data that we have going to bring us to the point where we can make an informed and robust analysis. It's one thing when we drill deep in data to find those 4 or 5 respondents, in your case, that 10%. Yeah. That's a really cool group to find. But from a statistical perspective, if I have this huge data set and I'm only finding that 10%, I may need to look at it from a different perspective. So it's this idea of balancing the information need that I have with the robustness of the analysis. So we start looking at n sizes and things like that, that's where those become really important. To the flip side of it is, we also look and say, sometimes we're looking just for that context. So we have this statistic, we don't really know what it means, it can mean any number of things. Let's go out and talk to a couple of folks and just say, hey, this is what we heard, what do you think? And that provides us the context behind it. So it really becomes a balance between the two.
I think too, one of the things your question really pings on, and this is, the more we can break through and create a culture around sharing is key. There's a real difference in mindset between the people that are great at working with the data scientists, and the people that often hold the data, the owners, protectors, and guardians. And the difference is the people that are best at making magic with data often don't know what they're gonna find until they dig. And I've been negotiating that many times where it's, okay, this team that has the sales data wants you to be really clear. What columns do you need? How are you going to use this? Exactly what question are you answering with this? And sometimes we know that, right? Sometimes it's a very clear, transactional ask. We need this. We'll do this analysis. Often the richest stuff comes out of not knowing. As an example, we worked with a massive online retailer whose name is, on everybody's tongue probably when I say massive online retailer. We do a PR program for them where they dump a bunch of anonymized sales data, and and we look to tell an interesting regional story with it. One of the things we do is a most pampered pets in Canada release. When we were asking for very specific columns and rows, we got stuff like, this city loves cats. This other city spends a lot on fancy, wigs for their dogs, cute stuff. When we got a larger data set without knowing what we were looking for, our team was able to produce incredibly rich insights like the further you are away from a body of water, the more you spend on your fish, right? They didn't know they were gonna find that till they looked for it and started saying, okay, we need to have a data set that we don't know what we're looking for yet, find statistically significant correlations and start to ask ourselves, is there a story there or is there meaning there? And that for me is a really interesting tension because, and again, I'm often brokering those negotiations saying, okay, client, send us your data, anonymize it, but I need more data than less, don't worry about it. 10,000 rows is so much more helpful than 100 rows, And so I think that the more you can create that culture of, give it to the grown-ups, don't let a brand manager take a 10,000 row data set, they will not know what to do with it. But if you have people that have that capability, think about a way that there can be more open, exploratory, curiosity-driven, just correlation finding, because you may find there's real insight and magic there.
I think it's somewhere, we had conversations earlier about kind of the art and the science part, right? And so you can kind of think of it as if you commission a piece of art from artists, like, hey, this is what I want to feel at the end.
Right.
These are some of the things I like, but I'm going to let you take that piece of canvas, which becomes kind of your guidelines, and when I come back, hopefully it's something that meets kind of those expectations. But you can't really, when you start becoming very prescriptive of what exactly you want them to do with it, you're not allowing that freedom to go find those other things that can be inspiring or informative at the end, right? Or you could think of a block of ice. I forget the official name of people who chisel on the ice to make the art. It's going to be a lot easier to give them a huge chunk of ice and let them chisel down to what they need versus taking a bunch of small ice cubes and trying to meld it together and build into something because this is all I'm going to give you, right? And so you have to give the freedom to explore and get the things that from one discussion, until I get into it, sometimes I don't know what I don't know.
Right.
But agreed, and I like that both of you are framing it up, there is a balance. You have an end state in mind, there's a decision I'm gonna make. Because if you just swim in data, you can swim in data forever, and you come up with all sorts of stuff, but our goal here is to get to an insight, and an insight that's going to drive a specific decision. So carving out, and it's the first thing, that if you carve out time for folks to be relentlessly curious, it's the first thing to go. When you start getting under time crunch, when you start getting under budget crunch, it's the first thing to go. So you really have to defend that time, but I think hopefully helpful is the point that it's actually a balance. If it's 100% of relentless curiosity, you may find that you end up with, instead of a beautiful sculpture that was doing whatever motion you want, you end up with an ice cube. Well, that's great, but I didn't really want an ice cube. What I was trying to get was this. So have the outcome in mind, defend your curiosity time, but make sure that that's balanced by an ROI.
And don't be afraid to go back and forth. So don't be afraid to do the unboundless curiosity, uncover that insight, work the data that you've got, and then when you hit a brick wall, don't be afraid to go back and say, okay, we have to go back to the data set and look some more. Because we found this insight and we followed it to a natural conclusion, but it still leaves us wanting more. So don't be afraid to go back and spend that time doing the investigation piece.
Yeah, that goes back to the whole kill your darlings thing. Like the number of times that I find something in data that I think is insightful and I'm just holding on to it. I know there's an insight here, and the reality is there's nothing there. It was a correlation. There's billions of correlations. It means nothing.
Right. And I think a thing to think about when you start looking at relationships is there has to be context behind it. One of my favorite correlations is that there's a positive correlation between tornadoes and ice cream consumption. Now, someone might think, wow, ice cream causes tornadoes. Didn't say causality. So there was a relationship. It's because they both happen more frequently in the spring and the summer.
Yeah.
So it's this idea that when you start looking at correlations and you're going, wow, I have this great correlation, maybe not so much. But you don't understand that point. You don't get to that point unless you're relentless in your exploration.
And sometimes if it's just for a PR pitch, correlation, like fish and bodies of water, can still give you a good hook.
Great story,
but depends on how and where you're using your data, right? It's still a great story.
A great story.
That's exactly right.
And mine works if you're selling tornado generation machines.
That's exactly
So why wouldn't you say that?
Absolutely.
Kids love ice cream, tornadoes, there we go.
Super villains or something.
Exactly.
Storm chaser, ice cream trucks.
Exactly.
Whole new business model.
There it is. Done.
2 in 1. How do you bridge the gap between here's what the data means and here's how the insight impacts my company or my client? How do you
Right. So
go between those?
is it here's what the data means versus here's what the data means to my client?
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
Okay.
I think we touched on that a little bit throughout this, and I think at the end of the day, it's all about what's the decision we're making, what's the ROI on the data set that you're pulling together, and then telling a story that leads to that particular decision.
And I love that you keep using the word decision. For me, that's the filter. One of the things I talk about, I ask in every interview is, when does data become an insight?
Right.
And there's no right answer, spoiler for anyone that's interviewed with me, that, a million answers are the right answer, but one of my favorite is that idea, and that's my internal filter, is it drives the decision. Even if it tells a great story, it might be a little bit short of an insight if it doesn't drive a decision, right? If you wouldn't change your behavior in response to it, or reinforce what you're doing, or that to me that's the line of insight, and anything short of that is probably just info.
But if we look at the analyst,
Yeah.
the analyst is an expert in understanding what the data says.
Yeah.
Where is it the responsibility, especially in an agency model? Who owns here's what it means to the client? Is it the account team? Is it the analyst? Is it the planner? Who owns that piece of it?
Well, I'll tell you from our perspective, at least, we tell our analysts, don't do the analysis if you don't know what the decision is going to be. There's no reason to be doing, you're wasting your time. So, partly, we all own it.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
But it's important, maybe, there's probably a human that's responsible for making sure that everyone on the team understands what that decision is ultimately going to be, but everyone needs to understand what that decision is.
So everybody owns the bridge between here's what it means and here's what it means to the client, is what you guys are saying. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think there's sort of two things. One of my favorite creatives had the line, which was, it's everybody's job to be creative, but I'm the only guy that can get fired if I'm not. So I would say in this world, the strategist is the person that, in some ways needs to sit and own that, right? If it doesn't impact or drive a decision, I think of all three, of the account team, the analyst, and the strategist. I think the strategist is the one that if they can't close those knots and tie that bow, there's probably not the most ownership, but that's the reason they're at the table. But I think one of the reasons we often gravitate or we push against the simplistic, it's owned by this and not this person, as soon as you absolve anyone at the table from that, it's not their job and they don't have to think that way. And I don't think any of us can afford to create that culture, right? To your point, Mike, every single person at the table, if you're looking at the numbers, you should know what you're looking for and why. If you're scheduling a meeting with your client to walk through the numbers, you shouldn't be sitting there passively beside a very smart research person and watching their mouth move. You should know exactly what the outcomes are, exactly what you're trying to recommend or suggest, or it's everybody's job, and particularly the strategist's job, I think, should be a force in that room to really pull that together.
And the great analysts, they want that.
Of course
they
they
really
do.
just do. They know you could probably make data say anything you want it to say if you try hard enough. So they want to know what's the decision we're driving towards.
Right. Well, hey, I just want to say that before we run out of time, that I personally thank all of you for being here and being a part of the panel. The discussion today I thought was really good, and then I'll turn it over to Tina for some final words. And then we're good.
Thank you to everyone for joining us today online. We've had a great morning, good way to start out the day. And I think if anyone has follow-up questions, you can be sure to reach out to Dan or any of us at Padilla, and we'd be happy to answer those. But thank you again for being with us this morning.
Thank you.